Hey, my name is Jesus Castillo, and in this video, you're going to get an introduction to web development with Ruby. So what is web development? Web development is creating websites, right? But there are two kinds of websites. Have static sites and dynamic sites. What's the difference? Well, a static site is an information-only site, and it doesn't store any kind of data. There is no database, and there is no very limited user interaction, right? And there are some static site generators for things like documentation and things like that. That's what static sites are useful for. And then we have dynamic websites, which is like 99% of the websites out there. And these kind of websites are the ones that allow you to log in, to create an account, to write comments, to add ratings, save a favorite, etc. So this interaction with the website, and the website remembers what you have done, right? Remembers your actions because it's working with a database to record data, right? So what are some examples of dynamic websites? Well, have Amazon, Google, YouTube, Facebook, many other sites are examples of this kind of website, right? And that's what you're going to be building most of the time, dynamic websites. Inside dynamic websites, there are two parts that you need to understand. There is the front end and there is the back end. So the front end is the user interface. So this is everything that the user can see when they visit this website. So these are things like login forms, product pages, then YouTube videos. This page you're watching right now is the front end, right? So the front end is everything that the user can see. It's the user interface. And then we have the backend. What is the backend? Well, the backend is where all of the actual work happens. What kind of work? Well, when you create a new user, it has to be saved somewhere, right? It has to be validated that you didn't enter any wrong information or invalid information, right? You make a purchase, that also has to be recorded somewhere, and if you send an email, the email has to go out, and all of these things happen in the backend, right? The backend you don't see as a user, that's why it's called the back end. You don't see it as the user, you only see it as the developer. Here is where you do all of these things, and you date the database, access the database, do things like access control, right? Is the user logged in, not logged in? Is the user an administrator? All of these things happen in the backend. So it's useful to understand this difference, because how you program and what programming languages you actually use and the techniques that you use are very different between the front end and the back end. So that's why it's useful to understand this difference. Now, front-end programming. There are three main programming languages, we could say. Well, CSS is not really a programming language. And some might say that HTML isn't either, because these are more like for defining a structure and a style, right? So you don't do logic in HTML and CSS. There is no logic like if this, then something else. That kind of logic, that doesn't happen at this level. So HTML is the site structure and elements. So with HTML you say, I want a button here, I want a form, I want this paragraph, I want this header, I want this image, right? This is how you say what elements you want and how they are related to each other. That's HTML. Then we have CSS. What is CSS? CSS is the styling language. It's how you say, hey, this button that we define with HTML, this button has to be green, or has to be orange, or has to be blue, it has to be this big, and it has to be this big, right? It has to be on the top, on the right of this other text. So CSS also does layout. So you can do like a column layout, so you can have some elements on the right and some other elements on the left, something like that, like a menu. You can have like a menu on the left and everything else on the right. That will be a column layout, right? And with CSS you also define the font size. So on that button that we mentioned before, you can say the text. You don't do the text will be HTML. The text itself is defined at the HTML level, but the size of the text and how the text looks, like the font size, the font color, all of that is defined at the CSS level because that's style, that's how it looks. And of course, positioning, you can say, I want this in column 1, column 2, or on the top of the page, always on the top of the page, on the footer, and all of that, right? That's CSS. So CSS is style and layout. HTML is content, site structure, and elements. And if you just have these two, that will be okay. You can make a lot of pages just with HTML and CSS on the front end programming side of things. These two are the foundations, we could say, right? Because with this you have the layout, the design, and you have the content. But on top of that, you can add JavaScript. And JavaScript is like the special effects. So, like in movies, you can have special effects like maybe explosions and things like that, and things slowing down and going faster. All of that kind of special effects that you can have in movies, that's what I call special effects in web pages. JavaScript is the language, it's an actual programming language that you can use to add some kind of special effects. What kind of special effects? Well, animations, notification messages. So JavaScript allows you to change the page dynamically. And maybe when you click a button with JavaScript, you can show a message. Or when you click a button, you can change some part of the page, and things like that. So JavaScript allows you to change or modify the current page, right? So that's what JavaScript is used for. The front end, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now the back end, you only need to know one thing, one language. From the front end, you need at least 3 different things to be good at it, to be proficient. You need the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript, right? But with backend programming, the backend side of things, you only need one language. And if you're watching this video, since I titled it Web Development with Ruby, I assume that you already decided to learn Ruby and to write your backend, and to write your web application using Ruby, right? So Ruby allows you to access the database and calculate order totals and you also check if the username and password is valid, and all of these things. So all of the hard work, we could say, all of the real work, we could say, happens in the backend, and you do that with Ruby. Now, let's talk about frameworks. What is a framework? Well, you might have heard of Ruby on Rails, and a mistake that a lot of beginners make is to confuse Ruby with Ruby on Rails. They are different things, right? Ruby is a programming language. It's how you tell the computer to do things, right? But Ruby on Rails is different. Ruby on Rails is built on top of Ruby, and it helps you create web applications. So a framework is a set of tools and components that you can use to help you do something. In this case, create web applications. So Rails has many of these components that help you, that make things easier. Like, for example, Active Record. So Active Record is one component of Rails that helps you work with the database very easily. Then we have Active Support, which adds additional functions that also make things easier for you. Rails also implements what's called the MVC architecture. What's that? Well, MVC stands for Model View Controller, and that's just a way you organize your code. You separate your code into different sections, we could say, right? So that's what Rails does for you. Also, Rails does something that's called convention over configuration. What does that mean? Well, that means that Rails already made, the developers of Rails, the framework, already made a lot of decisions for you on how things should work and how things should be structured. One example of that is the directory structure that Rails gives you by default. So there are some folders and files that are created by default, and Rails wants you to follow these conventions. And Rails also wants you to name files in a specific way, your classes in a specific way. So when you follow these conventions that Rails has already decided for you, then you have to think less and do less work, because you don't have to make these decisions yourself every time that you want to create a web application. But you still have the flexibility of changing things if you want. So that's it. That's the introduction to web development in Ruby. Gave you like the big picture kind of overview, so you can get an idea of what's involved in developing a web application. If you like this video, make sure to click the like button for me, so I know that you like this video. And if you want to keep learning, make sure to subscribe to the channel now, so you can keep learning and improving your Ruby skills. Also, visit my website rubyguides.com for more Ruby tutorials. Thanks a lot for watching. See you in the next video.